je vais passer à l'anglais dans une seconde, mais je voudrais juste dire que c'est évidemment très spécial d'être ici aujourd'hui après l'horreur à Paris hier. Moi, j'étais place de la République hier soir avec mes enfants qui n'avaient jamais vu un rassemblement de cette taille. Et les événements sont passés à quelques centaines de mètres de leur école. Et bon, voilà, prendre l'avion ce matin, j'ai pas beaucoup dormi. Bon, et on va continuer parce que c'est ce qui était prévu et puis c'est comme ça. Mais je voulais juste dire ces quelques mots en français pour commencer. So, let me now switch to English. Well, as you can hear, my English sounds a lot like French, so it will not... So for those of you who know French, it should look, familiar. But I assume more people speak English than French in this room, so English is probably more adequate. So this, I'm really very happy to be here today in Madrid to talk about this book. I'm very happy that my book is now available in Spanish, and I'm very grateful to my publisher for making it available not only in Spain but also all across Latin America. And of course, this is a very important event for me to be able to reach the Spanish-speaking public. And I was told this was a very nice and beautiful translation, and I am not able to say, unfortunately. I apologize that I am not able to speak in Spanish. As you can see, I'm not so good with foreign language. But anyway, so today, I will make a presentation based on this book. I will present a number of results. Let me first say very clearly that this book, this is called Capital in the 21st Century, but now that you are in the room, I can tell you the truth. This is mostly about the 19th and the 20th century. This is mostly a book about the history of income and wealth distribution. And I try to draw conclusion for the future in the last part of the book, but let me be very clear that I am much better at analyzing the past than the future, and that, you can disagree with pretty much everything I say about the future, and I have no problem with this. I think the purpose of the book is first to put together a large body of historical evidence on income and wealth distribution, and then ultimately, I want, the objective is to help people to make their own conclusion. This book really comes from a very collective research program. So I started working on the history of income and wealth distribution in France about 15 years ago, and then I was very fortunate to find many co-authors and collaborators. Tony Atkinson extended my work for Britain with Emmanuel Saez, who, by the way, is French but also half Spanish or a quarter Spanish. We extended this to the US and to a number of other countries with Facundo Alvaredo, who's from Argentina and who work on Spanish data with Emmanuel Saez. We've also been working on Argentina with Abhijit Banerjee on India. So this has become a very international research program. And I think this was the first time that so much historical data on income and wealth was collected. Probably because until recently, this kind of material was viewed as too historical for economists and too economic for historians, so nobody was really doing it. But at the end of the day, I think this is of interest for everybody. I think there is a lot to learn from the broad international historical perspective on income and wealth and public debt and capital and inequality that I offer in this book. There's a lot to learn from other countries. In a way, what I'm trying to fight in this book is intellectual nationalism, the view that our problems are unique and that there's only one solution to our problem. And, in France, sometimes we tend to view ourselves as unique. I don't know in Spain, but probably sometime as well. In the US, in China, everybody tends to view their own historical trajectory as so specific that there is nothing to learn from others. But I think there's always more than one solution, in particular to deal with public debt. And there's always a lot to learn from the experience of other countries. So this is ultimately the main objective of my book, is to try to draw attention to this very diverse set of experience. We've already had inequality crises in the past. We've already had public debt crises in the past, even much bigger than the public debt we have now. And there are different ways to solve this problem, and I think we can get to better solution, in particular in Spain and in Europe right now, by taking into account these broad lessons of history, which we sometimes tend to forget. So in this presentation, I will show a number of results from part 2 and 3 on the book, but this will only be a small part of the results of the book. I'm sorry that if it will look a bit too technical, I will present a number of graphs and figures and tables, but I think this is a way to show you, some of the most important materials that's in the book. The book itself, I think is very accessible and readable and can be read by anyone with no economic background. It includes references to the political debate, references to the literature, because I think the history of income and wealth is much more than an economic history. It is a political, a social, a cultural history. It depends on the representations that people have of the economy and of inequality. And so, this presentation will look to you maybe a bit more technical than what the book really is. But, I want to show you some of the facts and graphs and the data that we have put together. So all graphs and statistical series are available online on this website, which you can have a look in order to have a sense of the complete materials that's in the book. I'm sorry that I cannot put the book online, but probably my publisher will disagree with this. So, but at least the statistical series are all online, and all the graphs and tables are all online. So a big part of the data in the book comes from the World Top Income Database. So the World Top Income Database, so all the countries in red are already in the database. The countries in blue are about to enter the database. In fact, one interesting impact of the publication of the book is that we have now more countries like Mexico that are in blue and that are about to turn in red, or also Taiwan and Korea, for which the access to the fiscal data was impossible until recently, and partly because of the publication of the book and the pressure that were made on a number of governments, it became easier to access the fiscal data. And so I'm very happy that we are now, there's now online in this World Top Income Database even more countries than what we have at the time of the book. So this was the map at the time of writing the book, but now there are more countries and there will be more in the future. So what does it mean to be in the World Top Income Database? It means that we have tried to collect all the historical data on income that we could find for a given country. So in the book, I try to shift attention from income inequality to wealth inequality, but of course both are very important. So I'm going to start today talking about income inequality, and then I will move to wealth. The oldest data source on income inequality is usually the income tax itself. So the income tax was created in France in 1914. In the summer of 1914, the parliament finally accepted to create an income tax. This was not to pay for schools. This was to pay for the war, to go to war with Germany, which is a bit sad, but this is the way things happen. In some other European countries, it was created before the war. In Britain, the proportional income tax that had already existed in the 19th century was made progressive in 1908. In the US, it was created in 1913. In Germany and in a number of Nordic countries, it was created a bit earlier, around 1890, 1900, in Japan also. In some other countries, it was created in the interwar period, including in Spain and in a number of Latin American countries. So in general, it is between 1900 and 1920 that the income tax was created. And this is when we start for our income tax database. It's important to to realize that the taxation is always more than taxation. It is also a way to produce information about society. And when you don't have an income tax in the 19th century, you have no information about income. So it's not that the information about income you get in the income tax is perfect, but it's better than when you have no information at all. So the first economist to use this kind of data to construct income distribution series was Simon Kuznets, who was a US economist in the 1950s. And all what we've done, in a way, is to extend his work to more countries and more time periods. So let me show you one example of what we find, taking the example of the US, which was the initial countries that Kuznets studied. So this is one estimate of income inequality in the US. So more precisely, this is the share of total income going to the top decile. So the top decile is the top 10% income holders. So you can see that this goes between 30% and 50%. So these are the typical orders of magnitude for income inequality. Usually you have between 1/3 and 1/2 of total income going to the top 10%. If we were looking at the inequality of wealth, the inequality of property, it will always be a lot more than this. If you take property wealth, the share of total wealth in a country going to the top 10% will typically be between 50 and 90%, so even more than this. Okay? But let's start with income inequality. Now, what you see here is that you have a big decline in inequality in the first half of the 20th century, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s. Then you have a stabilization in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Then you have a big increase. Okay? Now, the decline between 1920 and 1950 was exactly what Kuznets found. So Kuznets, let me talk a little bit about Simon Kuznets. He was a US economist who was actually born in Ukraine but moved to the US as many other people and became a very important US economist. He got the Nobel Prize a long time ago, and he was the first, he was actually the founder of US national accounts. He was the first one to compute GDP, national income, for the US in the interwar period. And then his next work in the early 1950s was to use the income tax data, which started in 1913 in the US, to compute the share of total income, of total national income, going to the top 10%. So this was really the next step. Once you know how to compute the GDP or the national income of a country, you want to know the distribution of this national income. And he came with a very good news, which was a decline in inequality. So this was, this was only for one country over a 35-year period. He worked between 1913 and 1948. This was his time period. But this was a lot more than what we had before. In the 19th century, Marx and Ricardo had been talking about income distribution, and everybody had been talking about inequality forever, but with no data. So, there are limits to what you can say when you don't have data. And so with Kuznets, this was the first, quantitative historical study. And in addition, he came with a very optimistic conclusion, which was a decline in inequality. Now, to be honest, when you read Kuznets, he was very much aware that there was nothing really natural in this decline in inequality, that this had a lot to do with the Great Depression, World War II, and very specific policies that were taken in the US at that time. So during the war in the US, you had the National War Labor Board, which reduced the inequality of wages a lot. You had a lot of progressive taxation. So there was nothing natural in this decline in inequality. Well, there's never anything natural in economic evolution in general. It depends on the institutions, the policies that we choose. But here it was, the first half of the 20th century is full of huge political shocks, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and there was nothing natural in this decline in inequality. But in the post-war period, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, people, particularly in the Cold War context, wanted to believe in happy end, or at least in capitalist countries, people were happy to believe in this optimistic view of the Kuznets curve, according to which in advanced stages of development, you have naturally a decline in income inequality and then a stabilization of inequality. And indeed, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you can see the stabilization in inequality with about 1/3 of total income going to the top 10%. So when you have a stable share going to the top 10%, what this means in a very concrete manner is that everybody benefits from growth in the same proportion. So if you have a 3% growth rate or a 2% growth rate in 1960, 1970, a stable share going to the top 10 means that the average income of the top 10 is rising at 3% per year. The average income of the bottom 90 is also rising at 3% per year. So this is like the post-war ideal of balanced growth, where all social groups in societies benefit from growth in the same proportion. So all you care about, in a way, is to increase growth because, everybody will benefit from growth in the same proportion. So, you have rich people, poor people, but at least everybody is rising exactly at the same speed. Now, in the recent decade, starting around 1980, you have a very different kind of evolution. So you can see in the US, the share of total income going to the top 10 has gone from about 1/3 to about 1/2, and in fact, in 2012, which is the latest data point I have shown, it is 51% when you include capital gains, which you should include. Capital gains include in particular the incomes from stock options, which are very important for top managers in the US. So capital gains is what you make by selling shares on the stock market, and this has become a very important form of income in the US, but also in a number of European countries. So, of course, it's a very cyclical component of income. When you have a stock market crash in 2001, 2002, or in 2008, 2009, this is not a good time to make capital gains. But then after the stock market crash, this rises again. And you can see that in 2012, we are already above 2007, which was itself a little bit above 1928. Okay. So, of course, looking at this graph and the fact that the top levels of inequality were in 1928, 2007, I think many people in the US have concluded that, maybe rising inequality was not so good for the financial stability. And I think indeed that, the rise of inequality in the US, many people now agree that this has contributed not only to the stagnation of median incomes, but also to the rise of household debt, and eventually this has probably contributed to fragilize the financial system. It's important to realize that when you go from 1/3 to 1/2 of total income going to the top 10, this is really a very large macroeconomic shift. This is not just a few people who are getting very rich, but if it's only a few people, we don't really care. But here we are talking about big numbers from a macroeconomic viewpoint. This is a domestic imbalance, if you want, which is enormous. If we sometimes we want to blame others for the financial crisis, or a popular theory in the US, well, this is the fault of Germany or China, who have a trade surplus that have too large as compared to our trade deficit, and this has created international imbalance. It's important to have in mind that the trade deficit in the US was at the maximum 4% of GDP. This is 15% of national income that has been transferred from the from the bottom 90% to the top 10%. So the domestic imbalance, if you want, is even bigger than the international imbalance. And another way to put it is that over this time period between 1980 and 2012, it's about 2/3 of total US economic growth that has been absorbed by the top 10%, most of it by the top 1%. So given that the growth performance of the US economy was not particularly good by historical standards over this time period, with a per capita GDP growth rate of about 1.5% per year between 1980 and 2012, if you have 2/3 or 70% of this going to the top, it's not clear whether this is really a good deal for the rest of the population. So this clearly contributed to the stagnation of median incomes. Now in Europe, in Spain or in France or in Germany, I'm not going to show you all the graph, you will find, if you go to this website, you will find the same graph for every country, but I'm not going to show them to you. Let me just summarize. In Europe, you would have an increase in top income shares in the recent decades, but it will be much less spectacular than in the US. So in Europe, the rise of inequality, at least from the top, has been much less spectacular than in the US. and this is not a reason to wait that it becomes as big as in the US to worry about it, but I think it's important to be aware of that. Europe now has other problems with unemployment, with the public debt. This is a different kind of inequality crisis than in the US. So why is it that the increase in inequality has been so high in the US? There are several explanations that probably played an important role. One is probably, people usually say, well, that's globalization. You have China entering the world labor market, and, that's pushing the low wages down because low-skilled workers are now in competition with Chinese workers. Now, that's probably part of the explanation, but that's not enough because globalization happened everywhere, not only in the US, also in Europe, in Japan, and you don't have such a big rise of inequality in Europe, probably because the social and educational institutions, are still more egalitarian in Europe than in the US. So what you need to explain this bigger rise of inequality in the US is probably that you have very unequal access to skills and education in the US. So, you have very good top universities, but the bottom half of the population in the US doesn't go to Harvard, of course, and the quality of the high school is not always very good, and probably this has contributed to this very unequal development in recent decades. Also, top managerial compensation have increased to a point which is very difficult to justify on the basis of performance, of productivity, and that seems to have to do more with the ability of top managers in certain cases to take for themselves a pay package which are just extremely large and have really nothing to do with their performance. And what I will show you at the end of this presentation is that maybe the very large decline in top income tax rate in the US over this time period probably has contributed to change the incentives of top managers to try to obtain for themselves a very high remuneration package, and probably this has also contributed. Let me now move to another evolution which I think is more relevant for Europe, which is relative to the evolution of wealth rather than income. So this is an indicator of income inequality. Now I am going to show you another graph which looks a little bit like this one, but which in fact involves a very different economic mechanism, and in fact involves different parts of the world. So this is particularly strong in the US, this rise of income inequality, but less strong in Europe and Japan. This second graph is particularly strong in Europe, and I will show you Spain a bit later on, but Spain is very representative of the evolution that we have in these other European countries. Well, I will not show you Spain for the entire time period, but for the recent period, for the recent decades. So this evolution, it looks a little bit like this one. You have this U-shaped pattern with a decline during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and an increase. But in fact, it has nothing to do. So this is mostly this is mostly happening in Europe and Japan, and this is mostly happening in the US. So what is this second graph? So this is the capital income ratio. So what is the capital income ratio? So in my book, I use capital and wealth as synonymous, and this includes all the assets that private individuals or sometimes the government can own. So this includes real estate assets, but also business assets, financial assets, minus all debt. Okay, so wealth or capital will always be a net wealth or net capital concept. So you take the value of everything you own minus your debt, and you divide by national income. So you can see that at the beginning of the period, you have a very high capital income ratio in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, with between 6 and 7 years of national income in wealth. This corresponds to a society where wealth and capital is playing a very important role, and Wealth and capital are very important in the 19th century, not only in the literature, in Balzac or Jane Austen, but they are also very important in real life. It's just the total value of wealth relative to 1 year of income or 1 year of GDP was very high at that time. In the book, one of the reasons why the book is so long is that I don't just make the big addition of all these forms of wealth or capital. I look separately at the history of real estate, at foreign investment, at agricultural land, at business assets. And of course, this involves different economic logic, economic process. And when you make the big addition and look at the total value of wealth or capital in a given society, that's a big simplification of the real world. And the reason why the book is so long is because I try to give a much more detailed, multidimensional history of capital ownership and the social and property relations and conflicts that come with the different forms of property. But it is also useful for some purposes to try to look at the total value of wealth in society relative to income. Now you can see this big decline in World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and then the increase which starts, in fact, in the 1950s or 60s. And now we are close to, we are not back to the pre-World War I level, but we are close to this level. Now, let me be very clear about the fact that there is nothing bad about having a high capital-to-income ratio. In fact, it's good to have more capital. Sometimes in Europe we feel very depressed that we have a lot of public debt relative to GDP. But we forget about the capital side. If we only had debt, it will be indeed a bad situation. But in fact, our private wealth. So on this graph, what you have is the total value of aggregate private capital. So this is what private individuals own. And you can see that this has increased a lot as a fraction of national income. So national income is almost like GDP, so you can think of this as a fraction of GDP to simplify. And you can see that this has increased enormously, from 2-3 years of national income in private wealth in the 1950s, 1970s to 5-6 years today. It is lower in Germany, partly because of lower real estate prices. And also because Germany did not make a very good foreign investment with all their trade surplus, which probably explain part of the reason why they tend to be a little bit nervous these days with their foreign investment. But you have the same general evolution everywhere, and I will show you more European countries later. You will see that you have the same general evolution. So let me make very clear that in this reaccumulation of capital that you have in the post-war period, there's something perfectly natural, and it's not necessarily bad. We should not be nostalgic of 1950 where everything had been destroyed. So, in fact, the big decline in the capital-income ratio, that's not only destruction, it's a combination of course, destruction of capital stock, particularly in France and Germany during the war, but also lack of investment. Between 1910 and 1950, most of the private saving was used to pay for the war, to pay public debt, to finance the war, instead of being invested to build new capital. So the saving was used to pay for the war, which itself was used to destroy the rest of the capital stock. So, this is a very sad story, but this is the story of Europe. And finally, part of the reason for the low private wealth to national income ratio in 1950, 1960 is due to policy. So when you have nationalization, for instance, you have less private wealth, but you have more public wealth, and I will show you later the evolution of public wealth. When you have rent control policy, you have lower level of real estate prices in the 1950s, 60s, and when we have today. This is not necessarily bad. So, this evolution of capital-to-income ratio reflects many different forces. Some are just physical accumulation of capital. Some are the relative price of capital relative to other goods. In any case, I'm showing you this evolution, not to conclude that it is bad to have a higher capital-to-income ratio, just to conclude that it's, the problem is not so much the quantity of capital, but the inequality in capital ownership. Now, the problem is that in practice, you could have this evolution in a society where everybody, in a perfectly egalitarian society, where everybody has the same share in the capital stock, everybody has the same apartment, everybody has the same share on the stock market through some gigantic pension fund, and there will be nothing bad of having this rising capital income ratio. The problem in practice is that the inequality in capital ownership, as I said before, is very high. So the share of total wealth going to the top 10%, is even higher than the share of income going to the top 10%. As I said before, it's typically between 60 and 90% for the top decile share in wealth. So when you increase the wealth to income ratio, you also tend to increase total inequality. In particular, what this means is that for the new generation, access to property, is much more difficult than for the baby boom generation, with the kind of real estate price in Madrid or in Paris or in London. If you only have your labor income, that's this will have to be a very high labor income if you want to become an owner these days, as you probably have noticed. And so that's part of the consequences of a higher wealth to income ratio. So the problem is more the inequality in access to wealth than the total value of wealth. So let me maybe in the rest of this presentation, I will mostly focus on these three. On the first 2 points. I will not talk too much about the third point. I will mostly focus on the first 2 points. So the first point, I have already started to talk about it. This is what I call the return of a patrimonial or wealth-based society. So that's particularly strong in Europe and also in Japan, where wealth-to-income ratios seem to be returning to very high levels. That's particularly true in Europe and Japan because these are countries with low population growth as compared to the US. So the per capita growth is not too much different, but the population growth is a lot higher in the US, whereas in Europe and Japan it is close to zero or even negative in some cases because of very low fertility, and this is of course very relevant for Spain. Now the intuition is that in a slow growth society with very little population growth, wealth accumulated in the past can naturally become very important, and in the very long run this can be relevant for the entire world. Now my second point will be about the future of wealth inequality. So as I said, having a higher wealth to income ratio is not necessarily bad. The problem is wealth inequality. And what I will argue is that one of the important determinants of wealth concentration is the gap between R and G, where R is the net of tax rate of return, particularly for large wealth portfolio, and G is the growth rate. And what I will argue is that to the extent that we will have a high gap between R and G in the future, because of the decline in growth, particularly population growth, because of increased competition to attract capital, maybe also financial deregulation is contributing to rising inequality in financial returns. So, if you have a large wealth portfolio, you have access to financial products and financial returns, which can be a lot higher than if you just go to your bank with 10,000 euros, which, as you probably have noticed, the kind of return you get these days is not particularly good. So, when we talk about the gap between R and G, it's important to have in mind that not everybody has the same R, and so I will emphasize this in my presentation. Now, different policies and institutions, of course, could allow to spread wealth even more. So, it will, it's not the only, R minus G is not the only mechanism that matters, and, different choices of policy, in particular in Europe, could make a difference. So let me start with the return of a patrimonial society and the rise of wealth to income ratio. So this is, this is the same evolution as this evolution, except that now I am going to focus on the 1970 to 2010 period, and I'm going to show you more countries. So here I have only 3 countries, here I have 8 countries, and here I will show you Spain. So the difference also between this graph and the next one is that on this graph, everything looks very smooth because I look at decennial averages. I make averages over 10-year period, so everything looks very smooth. You only have very long-term evolution. Now, I'm going to show you now annual series, and you will see that it is much less smooth, because the history of capital is never smooth. You know, the history of capital is always chaotic. You know, putting a price on capital is complicated, as you know, in Spain, and putting a price on housing in particular is complicated, but putting a price on the stock market is also complicated. So when you look at annual series of wealth to income, you have huge fluctuations that are related to this movement in housing price and stock market price, which you don't have here because we take decennial averages. So both viewpoints, you know, the long-term viewpoint and the short-term viewpoint are important. You know, it's important when we are in the middle of a short-term evolution not to forget the long-term pattern in which we are. That's very important. But at the same time, you know, of course, in the long run, we will all be dead, and we have to take into account the short-run fluctuation. So let me move to this graph with the short-run fluctuation. So first of all, so here you have 8 countries. I'm sorry that Spain was not included here. It's because for Spain, we didn't have the data starting in 1970. We only have the data starting in 1985. So I will just include Spain on the next slide. So here we have the 8 countries: US, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Italy, Canada, Australia. Now you can see that you have a general rise. So this is again private wealth to national income. So in 1970, in every country, there was between 2 and 3.5 years of national income in private wealth in every country, whereas today it's between 4 and 7 years. Okay? So it means there's a lot more wealth. So to be very concrete, you know, national income on average, you know, if you divide the national income by the population in France or in Italy or in Britain today, it will be about 30,000 euros per capita. So on average, everybody has an income of 2,500 euros per month. So this is before every tax, you know, if there was no tax at all, if everybody had this full income. Now in practice, we put some of this income in common to produce public services, of course. And so if you have a ratio of 600%, this means that if average income is 30,000 euros per year, average wealth is 180,000 euros. So of course, a lot of people have less than that. A lot of people have more. You know, you can compute your beta ratio for yourself, the ratio between your wealth and your income, to check how you are as compared to the average. But you know, before we look at the distribution of wealth, it's interesting to see that this ratio of total wealth to income, you know, is changing a lot over time. So today in Europe, or in Japan, there is a lot more wealth relative to income than there was in 1970. And this is the same in Spain. So that's important to have in mind, because sometimes, you know, in economic textbook, you have the view that the wealth to income ratio or the capital to output ratio is a constant. So you should be very careful with economic textbook. You know, sometimes in economics, when we don't know much about something, we just assume it's a constant, which, you know, of course, if you have only one data point, everything is a constant. But in fact, there's, you know, when you have more historical series, it doesn't look at all like a constant, and there is no reason why it should be a constant. In fact, even in the most standard model of economic growth, where you have a substitution between capital and labor, any ratio of wealth to income could be a constant. So how do we explain this rise in wealth to income ratio? I already gave part of the explanation, which is the slowdown of population growth and economic growth. So you tend to accumulate more wealth for a given saving rate if you have a slow growth in the population, in the economy. Now, another part of the explanation is the increase in real estate price and housing prices. So you can see the Japanese bubble in 1985, 1980. So look at Japan. They go between 1985 and 1989, so in just 4 years, they go from 500% to 700%. So it means that they increase their wealth by the equivalent of 2 years of national income in just 4 years. Now, this cannot be just because of saving. You know, even with the Japanese saving rate, you cannot increase your wealth so fast, because you will need a saving rate of 50% of your national income each year to increase your wealth by 2 years of income in 4 years. Capital accumulation takes time. When you just save 10% of your national income each year, it takes 50 years to accumulate 500% of national income. So, this kind of simple arithmetic between saving and capital accumulation is important to have in mind. I think complicated mathematical models are not so useful in economics, but simple reasoning of this sort can be useful. So in the case of Japan between 1985 and 1990, the reason why this increased so much is, of course, because there is a real estate bubble, an housing bubble, and generally speaking, increase in real estate prices can play a very large role in this evolution. I think that's related to the first part of the explanation, because if you have a growth slowdown, and if the underlying economy is not rising very fast, and if you keep saving and investing, you have to put your money somewhere. So, of course, you could invest all your saving in China or on the other side of the world, but maybe you are a little bit afraid to lose your money, so maybe you prefer to buy real estate in Madrid or in Paris or in London, and so this will contribute to feed the real estate bubble. Okay? So let me show you now the Spanish case. So the Spanish case is quite impressive because you can see that the Spanish bubble, looks even bigger than the Japanese bubble. So, in 2007, you have a private wealth to income ratio in Spain of 800%. So it's still on the graph, but, I almost had to choose a different scale to be able to include Spain. And of course, this has started to decline a lot after 2007. So I'm sorry that I didn't put the most recent data for 2012-13, but right now it will be between 600 and 700% for Spain. So this has declined because of the fall in property price, but this is still very high. By historical standard, the private wealth to national income ratio in Spain is still very large, just like other countries. So Spain, in a way, is like an extreme case of what we have everywhere. So, it's not an abnormal case, it's just a little bit more extreme, and, this has to do with the particular history of Spain in this period. But, probably many of you in the room know much more than I do about this, so I'm not going to elaborate. But what I want to argue is that, you have a general, so in Spain, the series started only around 1985, so I'm not able to compare to 1970, but maybe there is some historical materials that could be used for Spain in order to have a longer run series, and I'd be very interested to talk about this. So I talk about the real estate bubble. It's important to realize that this has consequences. A world where we have a wealth to income ratio of 6 or 7 years of GDP, as compared to a world where you have a wealth income ratio of 2 to 3 years of GDP, it's a very different world in many important dimensions. This has very important consequences for different policies. I mentioned fiscal policy. For the new generation, it's difficult to buy an apartment with this kind of high level of real estate price. So probably when you have such a high level of wealth relative to income, and when you have a stagnation of wages for those who have a job, this is probably a time period where it will make sense to tax labor income and wages a bit less, and to tax wealth and property a bit more. I think in a way it's a matter of common sense. When you have so much wealth relative to income and you have a stagnation of income, I think it goes beyond left and right, or at least it should go beyond left and right. When you have such a big tax base, it's a bit stupid not to tax it a little more, which will contribute to get the price down a little bit, in particular for the large property owners, and that will in fact facilitate for the people who only have their labor income to enter wealth accumulation and to acquire small bits of real estate property. This also has consequences for financial regulation, of course, because in a world